Celia Lockhart had been thrown out of 3 church socials, 2 town meetings, and 1 very unfortunate quilting circle, and every single time, the reason written in the polite, pinched handwriting of some committee chairwoman was the same: too loud, too opinionated, too much. She did not consider herself too much. She considered herself exactly enough. It was the spring of 1878 when she arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, riding atop a rattling wagon bench beside old Emmett Greer, who had agreed to haul her and her 2 trunks from Wichita for $3 and a jar of her mother's pickled beets. Emmett had fallen asleep somewhere around the 2nd mile, and so Celia had guided the horses herself, talking to them the entire way, naming the brown one Biscuit and the gray one General, telling them both about her plans with the frank confidence of someone who had never once been given a reason to whisper. She was 24 years old, taller than most women and a good number of men, with copper-brown hair that she kept pinned up but which always escaped by mid-morning into wild curls around her ears. Her eyes were the color of creek water in late afternoon, somewhere between green and gold depending on the light and her mood. And her laugh, God, her laugh, was the kind that made strangers turn around in the street, not because it was unpleasant, but because it was so entirely unafraid. Caldwell in 1878 was a cattle town crouched at the Kansas Indian Territory border, dusty and ambitious, and buzzing with the kind of energy that came from too many men passing through with money in their pockets and not enough women to civilize anything. The main street was 2 blocks of false-fronted buildings pressed close together like they were holding each other up, and beyond them in every direction the land stretched out flat and enormous, wheat gold and sky blue, and so vast that it seemed to breathe. Celia had come because her cousin Dorothea wrote her letters every few months describing the opportunities available to a woman with practical skills and no particular attachment to a narrow life. Dorothea ran the boarding house on Chestnut Street, a 2-story frame building with 8 rooms, a communal dining table, and a reputation for the best biscuits west of Wichita. She needed help. Celia needed a new start. The arithmetic was simple. What Celia did not expect, on her very first afternoon in Caldwell, was to nearly knock a man off his horse. She had climbed down from Emmett's wagon and was pulling her 2nd trunk toward the edge of the seat when it slipped, and she hauled it back with both arms and a sound that could only be described as a battle cry, and the gray horse tied to the post outside Harmon's dry goods startled sideways and dumped its rider clean into the street. The man landed hard on his back in the dust, boots in the air for just a moment before he rolled to one side and sat up. He was not a small man. He was, in fact, built the way the plains were built, broad and patient and giving nothing away easily. His hat had come off in the fall and lay 3 feet from him. His dark hair was thick and cut without particular attention to fashion. He had a jaw that suggested stubbornness and eyes the color of good coffee, and when he looked up at her, the expression on his face was not anger but something more like startled assessment, the way a man looks at a thing he did not predict. "I am so sorry," Celia said, and then she ruined it by also laughing, because the image of those boots in the air had been genuinely funny and she had never been able to hold laughter back the way a proper woman was supposed to. He looked at her for a moment. Then, to her complete surprise, he laughed too. He got to his feet without help, dusted himself off, retrieved his hat, and settled it back on his head. He was somewhere around 27 or 28, she guessed, with the kind of tan that came from years of outdoor work and the kind of quiet that was not absence but its own sort of presence. "Harvey Bristol," he said, extending a hand. "Celia Lockhart," she said, shaking it. "I really am sorry about the horse. Hector's been needing a lesson in composure," Harvey said. He glanced at the trunk. "You need help with that." "I had it," she said. "You did not have it," he said, without any particular meanness, just observation. She considered disputing this. Then she looked at the trunk, which was half off the wagon seat and going nowhere good without either help or disaster. "No," she admitted. "I did not have it." He lifted it down with the ease of someone accustomed to moving heavy things and set it on the boardwalk as if it weighed nothing. "Thank you," she said. "Where's it going?" "Dorothea Finch's boarding house. On Chestnut," he nodded. "I know the place." He picked up the trunk and started walking. She stared at his back for a moment, then grabbed her other bag from the wagon, thanked Emmett, who had woken up at some point and was watching the whole scene with bleary amusement, and followed Harvey Bristol down the street. Dorothea Finch was 41, capable, and completely unsurprised by anything. She greeted Celia with a fierce hug and Harvey with the warm familiarity of someone who had fed him supper enough times to consider him a fixture. She thanked him for the trunk, pressed a piece of pound cake on him, and shooed him out with the efficiency of a woman who had a boarding house to run and a cousin to settle in. Celia stood in the doorway and watched him go, and she told herself it was merely curiosity, the interest one always felt for a person encountered in unusual circumstances. She believed this completely and was entirely wrong. Harvey Bristol was, in the working vocabulary of Caldwell, a ranch hand with ambitions. He had spent the last 6 years working for a cattle operation called the Broken Spur, owned by a sunburned, fair-minded man named Thomas Aldridge, whose spread sat 4 miles south of town. Harvey had come to Kansas from Missouri at the age of 21 with $30 and a stubbornness that had outlasted poverty, bad weather, 2 cattle drives north to Abilene, 1 broken arm, and 1 very dishonest foreman named Cal Prout, who had since departed the territory under circumstances everyone agreed not to discuss openly. What Harvey wanted, what he had been carefully working toward with the methodical patience of a man who understood that land did not come easily to those who started with nothing, was his own place. He had been saving for 2 years. He had identified a piece of ground 6 miles east of town, along a shallow creek called Plum Creek, 160 acres of grassland with a small rise in the northeast corner that would catch the morning light beautifully. He had not told anyone this. He was not a man who announced his intentions before he could fulfill them. He thought about the woman who had nearly unseated him from Hector 3 or 4 more times that evening than was entirely comfortable, and then he told himself to stop it and went to sleep. He saw her again 4 days later at Harmon's, where she was in a thoroughly vigorous argument with Owen Harmon about the price of flour. Owen Harmon was a stocky, precise man who ran his store with the conviction that he was always correct, and he had clearly never encountered anyone quite like Celia Lockhart, who was leaning on his counter and explaining, with tremendous clarity and volume, why she was not paying 14 cents a pound when his competitor in Wichita was charging 11. "This is not Wichita," Owen said, for what appeared to be the 3rd time. "No," Celia agreed, "and yet flour is still flour and 14 cents is still 14 cents and I am still a woman with options." Harvey stood in the doorway and watched. He did not mean to smile. He smiled. He was spotted by Owen, who looked relieved by any possible interruption. "Bristol, you need something." "Rope," Harvey said, coming inside. He glanced at Celia, who acknowledged him with a brief nod and the air of someone who had not yet finished their current project. Owen, grateful for an excuse to move away from the counter, went to find rope. Celia straightened and smoothed her apron with the dignity of a woman who had made her point and was satisfied with it. "He'll come down a cent," Harvey said quietly. She glanced at him sideways. "I know, I'm giving him time to arrive at it himself so he feels he's had a choice." He looked at her. Something shifted in his chest, the way a fence post shifts in its hole when the earth is soft, not falling, just settling differently. "That's a fine strategy," he said. "Thank you. I find people cooperate better when they believe it was their idea." She tilted her head. "You work out at Aldridge's place, don't you? Dorothea mentioned you." "I do. She says you're the most useful person in 3 counties. He was quiet for a moment. "Dorothea's generous." "Dorothea is precise," Celia said. "She doesn't say things she doesn't mean." Owen returned with the rope, and after a brief pause, informed Celia that he could do 13 cents a pound if she was buying more than 20 pounds at a time. Celia smiled at him so warmly that Owen looked momentarily stunned, agreed to 40 pounds, and extended her hand to seal the arrangement. Harvey watched Owen shake it with the dazed expression of a man who was not entirely sure how he'd arrived where he was. Outside, she caught up to Harvey on the boardwalk. The sun was high and the street was busy, 3 cowboys moving a small string of horses past the livery, a woman shaking a rug from an upper window, a dog conducting important investigations near the barber shop. "How long have you been in Caldwell?" she asked. "6 years. Do you like it?" The question seemed to land on him differently than small talk usually did, like it genuinely wanted an answer. He considered it. "I like the land," he said. "The town's all right, it's loud enough." "I've been told I contribute to that," she said, without any particular embarrassment. "You do," he said, "and it doesn't bother me any." She looked at him squarely. He looked back. The afternoon light was doing something particular with the color of her eyes, and he was aware of this in the way you are aware of a sound you cannot immediately identify. "Good," she said, and turned toward Chestnut Street, and he stood on the boardwalk and watched her go and then thought about fence posts again. The weeks that followed were an education in Celia Lockhart. She was everywhere in Caldwell at once, it seemed. She helped Dorothea run the boarding house, which meant cooking breakfast for 12 at 6 in the morning, keeping the rooms in order, managing the laundry schedule with military precision, and handling disputes between boarders with a combination of fairness and such decisive firmness that the disputes rarely recurred. She also, within 2 weeks of arrival, had begun teaching reading to 4 children whose families could not afford the schoolmistress's fee, had organized a petition about the condition of the road at the north end of Main Street, and had introduced herself to what seemed like every person in Caldwell who was willing to stand still for more than a moment. She was too loud. Everyone agreed. She laughed in church. She asked questions at town meetings that the men on the committee had clearly not considered. She had opinions about cattle prices, water rights, and the quality of the wood used in the recently built schoolhouse, and she expressed them all with an enthusiasm that some found charming and others found exhausting, and a good number found both. The women of Caldwell were divided on her, as women's communities often are on a member who will not take her assigned place in the arrangement. Some loved her immediately, finding her a relief after years of performances of propriety. Others, and these tended to be the wives of the more established men, looked at her sideways and said things in soft voices at social gatherings about how unfortunate it was that some women had not been taught better, which was a kind of cruelty that wore manners as a disguise. Celia knew they said it. She had good ears and she was used to it. She had been called too loud since she was 5 years old and had shouted at her brother for stealing her biscuit at Sunday dinner, and her mother had hissed at her while her brother ate the biscuit in peace, and she had made a private decision at 5 years old that being heard was worth the cost. Her mother had died when she was 17 and her father the following year, and she had gone to live with an aunt in Wichita who was kind but quietly baffled by her, and she had worked and saved and been, for a while, almost small. Not on purpose, just because loneliness sometimes does that to a person. Caldwell was undoing the smallness. She could feel it in the way she breathed here, deeper, fuller, like the wide sky had given her permission. Harvey noticed her everywhere and tried not to make it obvious that he was noticing. He did not manage this as well as he hoped. Tom Aldridge noticed him noticing and said nothing, which was the way Tom handled most things. Cal Pruitt's old bunkhouse companion, a lanky, amiable man named Red Dooley, who had no loyalty whatsoever to Pruitt and great loyalty to Harvey, noticed and said quite a lot. "You've looked toward Chestnut Street 4 times in the last 20 minutes, Red observed one evening, leaning back in the chair outside the bunkhouse with his boots off and a comfortable expression. "I'm keeping track of the weather," Harvey said. "The weather is clearly stationary and right in front of you," Red said. "You want to tell me who she is, or should I just wait until you figure it out?" "There is no she." There is absolutely a she, and from the frequency of your looking toward Chestnut, I'm guessing it involves either Dorothea Finch, which I doubt, or the woman who's been reorganizing half the town. Lockhart, is it? Harvey said nothing. She's a good-looking woman, Red said thoughtfully. Do not start Dooley. She's also apparently smart as a tack and about as subtle as a thunderstorm, which I suspect you either find very charming or very terrifying. Go to sleep, Red. Both, Red said decisively. I think you find it both. Good night, Harvey. The thing was, Harvey Bristol had been careful with himself for years. He was careful in the way that men who have had very little tend to be careful with things, because things that are lost when you have little cannot be afforded again. He had been careful with his money and his trust and his plans, and the small, maintained hope that the life he wanted was still possible if he kept his head down and did the work. He had not been particularly careful with his heart, because there had been no particular occasion requiring it. There had been a girl back in Missouri whose name was Louise and who had married someone else while he was crossing Kansas for the first time, and it had hurt the way things hurt when you're 21 and still learning the distance between wanting and having. He had recovered completely. He had learned to be better at keeping distance. Celia Lockhart made distance difficult. It happened slowly and then all at once, the way rivers change their course. It started at the summer social in July, which Caldwell held on the 4th in the open lot behind the grain storage, with a fiddle player named Augusto who sweated through every performance with magnificent dedication, and tables covered in food, and the particular pleasure of a whole town being briefly unhurried. Harvey had not planned to stay long. He had come because Tom Aldridge expected his men to participate in community events, which was one of the many ways Tom had kept the goodwill of the town across 20 years. Celia was there in a blue dress that matched the late afternoon sky, and she was laughing at something the blacksmith's wife had said, and the laugh carried across the entire social like it always did, clear and unself-conscious and startlingly alive. 3 separate women nearby flinched. Harvey watched Celia not notice, or more accurately, not care. She was wholly herself in that moment, and he thought about what it must cost her to be that, in a place and time that charged women a continuous tax for it. He thought about it with something that was not quite admiration and not quite heartache, but lived in the neighborhood of both. He went and stood near the lemonade table, which happened to be near where she was standing, for reasons he told himself were about thirst. Mr. Bristol, she said, turning and seeing him with the directness that was simply how she operated. Miss Lockhart, good evening. Are you here in an official capacity or a voluntary one? Some of both, he said. Augusto's playing well tonight, she said. He is. He gets better when there's a crowd. Most people do, she said, and looked at him in a way that made him think she was saying something else as well. They talked, not about anything grand. About the town, about the summer heat, about the state of the road petition which had actually resulted in some improvement, about what the price of cattle was doing. She spoke as she always did, with total commitment to whatever she was saying, leaning slightly forward, eyes bright, not performing interest but actually having it. He found himself telling her about a horse he'd been working with, a difficult chestnut mare named Patience whose name was ironic, and she laughed and asked a question that showed she'd actually listened, and he told her more, and she asked another question. Nobody had asked him questions like that in a long time, like the answers mattered. When Augusto started playing a waltz, she looked at the dancing space and then at him, and he was not a man who danced particularly well, but he offered his hand anyway. The way you reach for something that matters before you can think of a reason not to, and she took it. She was warm and solid and real, and she danced the way she did everything else, with full commitment and genuine joy, and she was not delicate and she did not pretend to be, and he was aware of her hand in his with a clarity that went all the way through him. Afterward, standing apart from the dancers as the song ended, neither of them said anything for a moment. The evening had gone rose and gold and the fireflies were just starting at the edge of the grass. "I have been told," Celia said, in a voice that was quieter than usual but steady, "that I am difficult to be around." He looked at her. "Who said that?" "Various people across my entire life." She was not performing vulnerability. She was just stating a fact the way she stated things. "My aunt, several committees. A man in Wichita who said I would make a poor wife because I could not learn to be quieter." Harvey was quiet for a moment. He was thinking about the social, about her laugh carrying across the whole lot, about the way the women near her had flinched, about the smallness that some people tried to squeeze others into for their own comfort. "The land out here," he said, "goes on for miles in every direction. If you want someone to hear you from across it, you have to carry your voice a long way." He paused. "Quiet doesn't carry. Quiet stays right where you left it." He looked at her. "Loud is the only thing that travels across this land." She looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were very bright, and he thought there might have been something in them that was close to tears, though if there was, it didn't fall. "Harvey Bristol," she said softly. "Celia Lockhart," he said. They did not say anything else for a moment. They did not need to. It was Red Dooley who, upon Harvey's return to the bunkhouse that night, took one look at his face and said, "Well, you've gone and done it." Harvey said nothing. "You're in for it now," Red said, not unkindly. "She's the kind of woman who changes the whole shape of a person's life." Harvey sat down on his bunk and looked at the ceiling. "Yeah," he said, "I know." The weeks after the summer social were a new country entirely. Harvey found reasons to be in town more often than strictly necessary. He told himself these reasons were practical, and some of them were. He had business at Harmon's. He needed to speak to the land office. He had errands that could reasonably be run on a Tuesday afternoon as well as a Saturday. He and Celia fell into a kind of rhythm that was not yet courtship, but was clearly becoming something. He stopped by the boarding house in the evening sometimes, and Dorothea would arrange it so there was extra coffee and a reason for Celia to be sitting on the front porch, and they would talk until the stars were out, which happened earlier now that summer was moving toward September. She told him about growing up in Wichita, about her mother who had been a fine seamstress and her father who had fixed clocks and loved books. She told him about the quilting circle that had removed her for pointing out that the pattern they'd chosen for the church donation quilt was mathematically inefficient, and she could show them a better one, which was the kind of thing that, in retrospect, she could see had not been received as the helpful observation she intended. He told her about Missouri, about growing up on a tenant farm that never quite produced enough, about the two brothers he had who still lived there, about coming west with nothing, and the very specific kind of determination that comes from having nothing to lose. She listened the way she did everything fully, without looking away, asking sharp little questions at the edges of things that opened them up wider. He found, to his surprise, that he did not mind being opened. He had been closed for a long time by habit, and it had begun to feel less like protection and more like a room with the windows nailed shut. He told her about the land at Plum Creek. He had never told anyone about it except Tom Aldridge, who had known because Harvey had needed his opinion on the quality of the soil. He told her in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. It just came out, the way things come out when you trust someone without having planned to. She sat up straighter. "You've picked the spot already." "I have." "Have you filed?" "Not yet. I've got most of what I need. Another 4, maybe 5 months. She looked at him seriously. "What's the grass like in the northeast corner?" He stared at her. "How do you know there's a northeast corner worth asking about?" "There's a rise there," she said. "The land east of town along Plum Creek has a good lift to it along the north side. Dorothea's borders talk about the geography. I listen." "You listen to everything," he said, a little astonished. "Information is useful," she said simply. "What's the grass like?" "Good," he said, deep-rooted. "It'll hold in drought better than most." She nodded. "That's the thing with this land. You have to think about the dry years, not just the wet ones." He looked at her in the firefly dark and thought that she was the most extraordinary person he had ever met and that this was not a safe thought to be having. He was having it anyway. "Will you come see it?" he asked. The land. If I could arrange for Dorothea to come as well so it's proper. He said it carefully, because it was 1878 and propriety mattered in the ways that protected women's reputations, which he took seriously even when he found some of the rules unnecessarily complicated. Yes, she said immediately. I would like that very much. 3 days later, Harvey brought his horse and Dorothea's wagon, and the three of them went out along the Plum Creek Road on a clear morning with a sky so blue it seemed invented. Dorothea sat up on the wagon bench with Harvey and gave every appearance of being engrossed in the surrounding landscape while being entirely focused on the two of them. Celia stood on the small rise in the northeast corner and turned slowly, looking at all of it. The creek glittered silver in the morning light below the slope. The grass went gold and green in the wind in waves that reminded Harvey of the sea, which he had never seen but which he imagined must look like this, vast and alive and continuously moving. Beautiful, she said. She said it quietly, which was unusual enough that he paid particular attention. Yes, he said. She turned to look at him. The wind had come up and it had done the usual thing to her hair, pulling curls loose around her face, and she didn't fix it. You could put the house on this rise, she said. You'd see all the way to the creek from the front porch. That's what I thought, he said. You'd want the barn low, closer to water, and the garden on the south side for the light. He was very still. She was describing a life on this land in the specific practical language of someone who was imagining herself in it, and they both knew it, and neither of them said it plainly, and the restraint of that moment was almost more than he could bear. Celia, he said. Harvey, she said. Dorothea, on the wagon 20 yards away, was studying the horizon with tremendous interest. I don't have the land yet, he said. I don't have the house. I know that, she said. I'm telling you what I do have. I have the intention. I have 4 or 5 months of wages to go. I have the absolute certainty that I want to do it. He paused. I want you to know that. Why? She asked, not cruelly, just precisely. He looked at her. Because I'm hoping it matters to you. She was quiet. The wind moved through the grass. A red-tailed hawk turned slow circles above the creek. It matters to me, she said. He let out a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. She smiled at him, and it was not the broad public smile she used when she was working or debating. It was a smaller, warmer thing just for him, and it went into him like sun into cold ground. Dorothea drove them back to town with the satisfied air of a woman whose intuitions had been validated. September came in golden and warm, and then began its slow turn toward something sharper. Celia continued teaching her reading students, who had grown to 7, the children joined by an older man named Solomon Bell, who had come to Caldwell as a laborer from Tennessee, and who wanted, as he said with precise dignity, to be able to read the Bible for himself without needing anyone to do it for him. She taught him with the same matter-of-fact respect she gave the children, and he progressed with a determination that moved her in ways she didn't entirely say out loud. She also began helping at the land office 2 mornings a week, doing clerical work for the agent, a fussy man named Pemberton, who had initially tried to give her work that was beneath her considerable organizational ability, and had quickly revised his expectations when she reorganized his entire filing system in a single morning in a way that cut his processing time in half. He was not sure whether to be grateful or humiliated, and had settled on gratitude as the more dignified option. Harvey came to Sunday dinner at the boarding house most weeks now. Dorothea had stopped pretending it was coincidence. The boarders accepted him as a fixture with the incuriosity of people who had more pressing things to think about, except for a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Paulson, who watched Harvey and Celia with warm, explicit approval and occasionally made comments that were meant to be subtle and were not. At Sunday dinner in late September, Harvey arrived to find Celia in an argument with 3 of the boarders and one of their wives about whether women ought to be permitted to speak at the town council meetings on matters of public concern, a question that had been raised by the fact that the road petition, which Celia had organized, had been formally submitted by the 3 male signatories on it rather than by her, because women were not recognized as formal petitioners. The petition was hers, said a young boarder named Frank Oates, who was new to the West and still had Eastern ideas about fairness. She organized it and wrote it, said Mrs. Paulson, and the men put their names on it and stood up and presented it, which is how things are done and which I personally find ridiculous. It's how it is, said the wife of one of the other boarders, in the tone of someone who had made peace with things. How it is and how it should be are two different conversations, Celia said with perfect calm, and I'm happy to have both of them. Harvey sat down at the end of the table. He had come in during this and had not been noticed yet. He watched Celia hold her position with such easy certainty, not angry, just clear, and thought that she was entirely right and also that the world she was right in was going to make her pay for it in 100 small ways every day, and that there was something both brave and costly about deciding to be right out loud. She noticed him then. Something in her expression shifted, warmed. "Mr. Bristol," she said, "your opinion." "My opinion is that the petition was your work and you should have presented it, and the fact that you couldn't is a wrong I don't have the power to fix by myself." The table was quiet for a moment. "But," he added, "the road is better. That's also true." "Both things can be true," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "That's generally how injustice works. The thing gets done and the credit goes somewhere else, and the road is still better, and neither of those things cancels out the other." Mrs. Paulson looked at him with open approval. Frank Oates nodded earnestly. The wife of the other boarder stared at her plate with the expression of someone reconsidering something. After dinner, in the now familiar ritual of the front porch and the late evening, Celia sat beside him in the second chair that had appeared there with the quiet efficiency of Dorothea and said, "You meant what you said at the table." "I did." "A lot of men would have said something polite that didn't mean anything." "I know," he said. She looked at the dark street, the lamplight from the saloon down at the corner casting a warm rectangle on the dirt. "My mother used to tell me that I should learn to be more pleasant. Not nicer, she meant nicer, but she said pleasant. She thought if I could just be pleasant enough, the rest would be forgiven." "The rest being you," Harvey said. "Yes." A pause. "I tried. For a few years after she died, I tried very hard to take up less space." She turned to look at him. "It made me miserable and it didn't make anyone love me anymore." "No," Harvey said. "I imagine it didn't." "So I stopped," she said simply. "Good," he said. She leaned back in the chair and looked at the stars. He looked at her looking at them. The evening was cool now and the air smelled of dry grass and wood smoke from somewhere. "Harvey," she said to the stars. "Celia," he said to her profile. "If you're going to kiss me, you should probably do it before Dorothea comes out with the coffee, because she will absolutely watch and she will not pretend she isn't." He laughed, startled, and then he leaned forward and kissed her, gentle and certain. And she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything, and it was not a small thing. It was not tentative or polite. It was the kind of kiss that means, "Yes, I choose this," with full information and clear eyes, and when they parted, the world had rearranged itself into a slightly different shape that fit better. The screen door opened. "Coffee," Dorothea announced, with complete innocence. "Thank you, Dorothea," Celia said, composed and bright-eyed. Harvey accepted the coffee with a straight face that cost him considerable effort. Dorothea went back inside humming a tune he couldn't identify. October arrived with its particular prairie beauty, the sky gone a deeper blue and the cottonwoods along the creek burning gold, and the whole world looking like something from a painting done by someone who had never been told to be modest about color. Harvey worked the last stretch of the season at Broken Spur with the focused energy of a man who had a date in mind, a target, a shape of a future that kept getting clearer. He visited the land office on a Thursday morning in early October and sat down across from Pemberton and laid out his savings carefully, the amount and the plan, and Pemberton looked at it and told him he was close but not quite there. Another 6 weeks at minimum, possibly 8. Harvey nodded. He had expected something like this. He was good at the arithmetic of patience. What he had not planned for was Celia at the land office door, turning to find him there as she arrived for her morning's clerical work. "Thursday," she said. You don't usually come in on Thursdays." He was holding his hat in both hands, the way men do when they're thinking about something. "I came to check on some numbers." "What numbers?" She was not prying, or rather she was, but she was doing it with such open, honest interest that it was impossible to object. He hesitated. Then he told her. The land, the savings, the 6 to 8 weeks, all of it with the precision of someone who has organized and reorganized the same figures so many times they are worn smooth. She listened. She did not interrupt. She looked at him when he finished with the expression she wore when she was thinking carefully about something. "I have money saved," she said. "Celia, I'm not offering it as charity. I would never do that." She was very steady. "I'm saying I have it, and I know what I would want it used for, and that is a decision I am entitled to make." He looked at her. "You're saying—" "I'm saying that 6 to 8 weeks is a long time if there's a way to make it 3, she said. "And I'm saying that I have thought very clearly about what I would want my life here to look like, and I thought about it on that rise above Plum Creek, and I think you know what that means, Harvey, and I am not going to be coy about it because I'm not built for coy." He was very still. The land office was empty of anyone but Pemberton, who was in the back room and apparently very absorbed in something. "I want to ask you properly," Harvey said. "When I have something to offer, not before." "You already have something to offer," she said. "You've had it since you told me the truth at a town dinner when you could have said something polite and meaningless." She tilted her head. "But if you need to do it properly for yourself, I understand that too." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Will you wait 3 more weeks? Not because you have to, because I'm asking." "Yes," she said without hesitation. 3 weeks. He put his hat back on. He walked out of the land office. She watched him go and then sat down at her desk and picked up her pen and did absolutely no useful work for the next 20 minutes, which was unprecedented. The 3 weeks were not entirely smooth. There was a Saturday in mid-October where the wife of the town council's head member, a woman named Clara Whitmore, who had made various comments over the months about Celia's loudness and her opinions and her general failure to occupy her designated social space, said something at the dry goods store in front of 4 other women that crossed from comment into something that was simply unkind. It was about how some women were suited to run boarding houses and some were suited to be wives, and it was clear she meant these as mutually exclusive categories. And it was also clear she meant that Celia was clearly in the first and ought not aspire to the second. Celia heard it. The 4 other women heard it. The silence was the silence of people waiting to see what would happen. What happened was that Celia looked at Clara Whitmore with the focused, unbothered calm of someone who has been underestimated so many times that she has stopped finding it interesting. "I intend to do both," she said. At the same time, quite loudly, "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore." She purchased her goods and left. One of the 4 women present, a younger woman named Ada Marsh, whose husband had a small farm east of town and who had always watched Celia with quiet admiration, followed her out. "I wanted to say," Ada said, somewhat breathlessly, "that I thought that was exactly right." Celia smiled at her. "Would you like to come to dinner at the boarding house Sunday? I'm trying to talk Dorothy into apple cake." Ada blinked, clearly not having expected this direction. Yes, I would." Ada became a friend. Celia collected people who were honest with her the way some people collect good tools, recognizing quality and holding on. Harvey heard about the incident from Red Dooley, who had been told about it by the blacksmith's wife, who had been told by one of the 4 women present. He arrived at the boarding house that evening looking like a man who was choosing his words carefully. "You're going to say something about Mrs. Whitmore," Celia said on the porch. "I'm going to say that I'm sorry she said that. It's all right." "It's not," he said with quiet firmness, "and I won't pretend it is." She looked at him. "No," she agreed. "It's not, but I've been managing things like that my whole life and I'm still here." "I know." He sat down in the second chair. "I know you don't need anyone to protect you from words." "I don't. But I want you to know that I'm on your side of it, not because I feel sorry for you, because you're right and she's wrong and I'd rather stand next to right than across from it." She was quiet for a moment. Then, in the softer voice that she used only occasionally, the voice that was not smaller but different, more contained, she said, "You're a good man, Harvey Bristol." "I'm working on it," he said. She laughed, and the laugh went up into the evening and out into the street, and nobody flinched, and he thought it was the best sound in all of Caldwell, Kansas. On the first Saturday of November, with the mornings gone cold and the light changed to something thinner and more honest, Harvey Bristol rode to the land office, concluded the transaction that had been 3 years and one dream in the making, and walked out with a deed in his hand. He stood on the boardwalk for a moment looking at it. 160 acres, Plum Creek, the rise in the northeast corner where the morning light landed first. He rode to the boarding house at a pace that was not running, but was close. Dorothea answered the door and looked at his face and said, "She's in the kitchen," and then went somewhere else entirely with the tact of a woman who understood exactly what was happening. The kitchen smelled of bread baking and apple and wood smoke from the stove. Celia was at the large work table with flour on her hands and a look of concentration, and she turned when he came in and saw his face, and she went still. He set the deed on the table between them. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. He was going to be careful and prepared and articulate about this. He had practiced it twice. He had the words arranged. What came out instead was honest. "I love you," he said. "You are the loudest and most particular and most entirely alive person I have ever known, and I love every single piece of it. And I have 160 acres on Plum Creek with a rise in the northeast corner where the light comes in first. And I want to build a house there. And I want to build it with you. And I want you to be as loud in it as you wish. And I am asking if you will marry me, Celia Lockhart." She had flour on her hands and bread in the oven, and she crossed the kitchen and kissed him so decisively that the wooden spoon clattered off the table. And then she pulled back and said, "Yes, Harvey Bristol, I absolutely will," and her voice was bright and warm and carried all the way to the front parlor where Dorothea was pretending to read, and from there presumably out to the street. Mrs. Paulson, from the parlor doorway, said, "Oh, wonderful," with tremendous satisfaction. Dorothea put down her book and came to make coffee. They were married in December, on a clear cold Saturday with a pale blue sky and frost on the window frames of the small church on Maple Street. The minister, a soft-spoken man named Reverend Gray, who had performed dozens of weddings and considered this one among the more certain, read the words with appropriate gravity. Celia wore her best dress, a deep green wool that she had sewed herself over the previous weeks, with the particular focused pleasure of someone making something that matters. Her hair was pinned up, and there were copper-brown curls around her ears by the time the ceremony reached the vows, because there always were. Harvey wore his best coat, which was new. Red Dooley had made him buy it. Red was standing to his left looking proud and also slightly damp-eyed, which he would later deny absolutely. Ada Marsh and her husband James were there. Solomon Bell was there, who had progressed to reading the Psalms on his own, and who had pressed Celia's hand when he heard the news and said something quietly moving about deserving good things. Dorothea was there, which was all that needed to be said about Dorothea. Mrs. Paulson was there and wept openly and beautifully. A handful of the Broken Spur men were there, because Tom Aldridge had given them the afternoon. Tom Aldridge was there himself, standing with the warm dignity of a man who had watched a good person wait for good things and was glad to see them arrive. Clara Whitmore was not there, and this was noted by no one. When Reverend Gray said the part about speaking now or forever holding one's peace, there was a small cough from the pews that might have been comment but was probably just the cold air, and then they were married. Harvey kissed her properly in front of the church and God and everyone, and she kissed him back the same way, and Red Dooley whooped, and several other people laughed, and Mrs. Paulson pressed her handkerchief to her eyes, and Reverend Gray smiled with the contentment of a man who had done a good morning's work. They moved into a rented room in town for the winter while Harvey spent every free Saturday out at Plum Creek with a small crew of men, Red Dooley, James Marsh, two of the broken spur hands who came for the work in the company building the house. Celia came every Saturday too. She did not stand aside and watch. She painted. She measured. She carried lumber, which drew comments from the crew that died quickly under the combined weight of her total indifference to the comments and the fact that she was clearly useful. She had opinions about every room, practical opinions about light and airflow and storage, the opinions of a woman who had run a boarding house and understood that houses are machines for living, not sculptures to be admired from a distance. The house went up across the winter with the methodical joy of people building something they intend to inhabit. The frame in November, the walls and roof before the worst of the cold. The interior work through January and February, with a stove burning in the center of the open space to keep the workers from losing their fingers. On the 1st of March, 1879, they slept in the house at Plum Creek for the first time. The furniture was basic: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and the wood stove that had been installed in the kitchen. The house smelled of new wood and the dried lavender that Celia had hung from 2 beams because she had brought it from Dorothea's and it was hers, and she could hang lavender wherever she wanted. Harvey lay awake listening to the creek, which was running full with snowmelt, and to the sound of his wife sleeping beside him, which was the best and most real thing he had ever been near. And he thought about $30 and a long road from Missouri and all the years of patience, and it did not seem to him that he had come too long away for this. He had come exactly the right distance. Spring at Plum Creek was extraordinary. The creek rose and then settled, and the grass came in green and urgent, and the cottonwoods along the water put out their new leaves in that particular pale gold green that only lasts a few weeks before it deepens. Harvey began breaking the south field for a kitchen garden. Celia planted it with the seriousness of a military campaign, mapping out the rows on paper first, calculating what would grow best given the light and the soil, ordering seeds from a catalog with a focus that suggested she had been waiting a long time for a garden to put her whole attention into. She continued teaching her reading students, riding into town 3 mornings a week now, because she had decided the 4-mile ride was manageable, and she was right about that. Solomon Bell had progressed far enough that he was helping her teach the newer students, which was an arrangement he found dignified, and which freed Celia to work with the more advanced readers on writing. Harvey had a conversation with Tom Aldridge in April about the future, specifically about whether he intended to keep on at Broken Spur or go on his own. And Tom, who had known this conversation was coming for 2 years, told him he would miss his best hand and would help him acquire his first 5 head of cattle at cost, which was the kind of generosity that Harvey filed away in the permanent ledger of debts owed in gratitude rather than money. 5 head became 12 by summer through careful grazing and Harvey's particular talent with livestock, which was the patience to watch what an animal was telling you and respond to it, rather than imposing your plan on a creature that had its own. Celia had that same quality with people, he noticed. She watched them. Not the watching of a suspicious person or a calculating one, but the watching of someone who was genuinely interested in what people were actually doing as opposed to what they were saying they were doing. It was the quality that made her an extraordinary teacher and an honest friend, and it was the quality that had made her so difficult for small-minded people who preferred not to be clearly seen. In June, she told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen at 6 in the morning with the same directness she used for everything, looking him straight in the face, watching his reaction. He put down his coffee mug. He crossed to her and put both hands on her face and kissed her forehead, her temples, the top of her curled head, and she stood inside this with her eyes closed and her hands at his wrists, and when he pulled back she was smiling. "You're not worried?" he asked. "Worried is useful when there's something to do about it," she said. "Right now there is nothing to do about it except eat well and sleep enough and talk to Dr. Harding, which I will do this week. I'll come with you." "If you like," she said, as though it were optional, though something in her face said it was not. He went with her. Doctor Harding was a small, competent man who had been practicing medicine in Caldwell for 8 years, and who had delivered several dozen babies on the prairie and found this straightforward. He examined Celia, asked questions, answered questions in return without condescension, which he would not have attempted twice given who he was talking to, and told her she was healthy and the baby was due in January. "January," Harvey said, on the ride home. "Same month we moved into the house." "The house will be full by then," Celia said, and she was looking at the road ahead with the expression of someone planning something wonderful. The summer was full. The garden produced spectacularly, because Celia's plans were as detailed and effective as all her plans. Harvey expanded the cattle to 18 head and brought on a temporary hand named Billy Crane, a quiet 19-year-old from Oklahoma who was good with animals and asked few personal questions, which suited everyone. The house got a new set of shelves in the kitchen, built by Harvey on rainy Saturdays, and Celia filled them with the jar-by-jar accumulation of the summer's preserves, the peaches from the tree she'd had planted against the south wall, the cucumbers, the beans, the applesauce from 2 trees near the creek that were old and gnarled, and had clearly been someone else's hope before they were hers. She found out in July that the trees were there because a family named Kowalski had homesteaded the land in 1871, and had lasted 3 years before the combination of bad drought and family illness drove them back east. The story was told to her by an older woman in Caldwell who had been their neighbor, and Celia listened to it with great attention and went home and told Harvey, and they stood together looking at the old trees with the particular feeling of people who have inherited someone else's effort and who take that seriously. "We should keep them going," Celia said. "I plan to," Harvey said. "And maybe plant more, east of the barn, a proper orchard." He looked at the east side of the barn, which he had not yet done much with. "How many trees are you thinking?" 12 to start," she said. "Apple and some pear. Maybe a plum down near the creek if the water table's right." He nodded slowly. He was getting used to the way her mind worked, always several steps ahead of the present moment, laying foundations before you'd finished building the current floor. It had been unsettling at first and was now one of his favorite things about her, this sense that their life together was always becoming something. The fall was harvest and the long, beautiful dying of the year. The garden came down, the cattle did well, Billy Crane went back south. Harvey banked the savings from a good year, with the satisfaction of a man keeping a careful ledger. The house was warm and smelled of wood smoke and bread and lavender, and Celia's students continued to improve, and Solomon Bell could now read a full chapter of the Bible without stopping, and he read one aloud to the class one morning, and there was a silence afterward that was the particular silence of something landing exactly where it should. Celia's pregnancy was visible by October and openly known by November, and the reaction of Caldwell was, on balance, warm. The women who had liked her from the beginning brought things, small useful things, cloth and provisions, and a particular soft blanket that Ada Marsh made, and brought out to Plum Creek herself on a cold November afternoon, and pressed into Celia's hands with such affectionate firmness that Celia, who was not much given to tears, felt them threaten. Even Clara Whitmore, encountered in the street in November, said something about congratulations that was stiff but genuine, and Celia thanked her with real courtesy, because she had never wanted a war. She had only wanted to exist on her own terms, and those were different ambitions. December was quiet and cold, and the creek froze at the edges. Harvey cut wood and piled it high and brought in an extra blanket from town, and made sure the stove was banked correctly before they slept. He had read everything available about childbirth that Caldwell's doctor could point him to, which was not much but was something, and he had spoken at length with Dr. Harding about what to expect and what to do, with the thorough preparation of someone who refused to be helpless in an important situation. Celia found this endearing and told him so. "You've memorized the chapter about what to do if Dr. Harding can't get there in time," she said, in early December. "It's a 4-mile ride," Harvey said. "I want to know what to do." "You'll be fine," she said. "And so will I. I'm built for this." "You're built for most things," he said. "Flattery," she said, but she was smiling. "Observation," he said. January 1880, the house was full. The birth was attended by Dr. Harding, who managed the 4 miles in good time, and by Dorothea, who had come out 4 days early on the general principle that she intended to be useful and refusing to take no for an answer, and who had been invaluable. Harvey was present throughout because Celia asked him to be, simply and directly, and he stayed. The baby was a boy. He was born at 4 in the morning on the 12th of January, with the particular decisive energy of someone who had decided they were done waiting, and arrived quickly once they'd made up their mind. He weighed 8 pounds and immediately demonstrated a lung capacity that Dorothea said was genuinely impressive, and Dr. Harding said was entirely healthy, and Harvey, holding him for the first time, thought was the most extraordinary sound he had ever heard. And this was a man who had been saying for a year that his wife's laugh was the best sound in Kansas. "He's loud," Harvey said. "Of course he is," Celia said, exhausted and incandescent, propped up against pillows with the satisfaction of a general who has won the thing she came for. "Good," Harvey said, looking at the small red face of his son. "Loud carries." They named him James Thomas Bristol, James for James Marsh, who had helped build the house, and Thomas for Tom Aldridge, who had given Harvey his first real footing in the world, and Bristol because that was what he was, one of them, made of this and carrying it forward. The spring of 1880 was the most beautiful Celia had ever seen. She thought this was probably the baby, the way having a child shifts your attention to things you had begun to take as scenery. James was 4 months old and looked, as Red Dooley put it on his first visit, like Harvey made a strong argument at the planning stage, which was the most tactful way Red had said anything in living memory. He had Harvey's dark hair and Celia's determined eyes, and the specific quality of needing to know exactly where everyone in the room was at all times, which Dorothea said was a sign of intelligence, and Harvey said was a sign of someone who had learned early that this household was loud and interesting. Celia went back to teaching in March, taking James with her in a sling she had made from good cotton, which was not traditional and which she did not apologize for. The older students greeted the baby with the delight of people who had been let in on something precious. Solomon Bell looked at James with a quiet, moved expression and said he was fine-looking and would learn to read early, he could tell. "He already has opinions about the rhythm of the Psalms," Celia said seriously. "He goes very still when the cadence is right." Solomon Bell laughed. It was a good laugh, full and warm, and it went out into the bright March morning. The orchard went in that spring. 12 trees, apple and pear, planted in the good soil east of the barn, staked carefully against the wind. It would be 3 years before they produced meaningfully. Harvey planted them anyway. Celia planted 3 of them herself, with James on her back in the sling and the March sun on her face, and Harvey handing her things and neither of them saying much, because the morning was speaking for them. By summer the cattle were 24 head, a real herd, and Harvey had built an additional corral and expanded the barn. Billy Crane came back for the season and brought a friend named George Whitfield, who was 22 and methodical and good at the tasks that required sustained attention. The operation at Plum Creek was small but solid and growing, the way things grow when the foundation is right. Celia organized a proper reading school by midsummer, petitioning the town council, for the first time in her own name, for a formal slot in the calendar of community activities. The petition was co-signed by Solomon Bell, Ada Marsh, Dr. Harding, and Tom Aldridge, and it was, after a discussion that Harvey was told lasted 45 minutes, approved. The school met twice a week in the back room of the church, which Reverend Gray offered with the enthusiasm of a man who considered reading the Bible its own argument for literacy. By the end of the year, the school had 31 students across 3 age groups, and Celia had recruited 2 additional teachers, Ada Marsh for the youngest children, and a young woman named Rosa Garza who had come to Caldwell from the Texas border, and who spoke both English and Spanish with equal fluency, and who was teaching a handful of Spanish-speaking students who had been previously excluded from any formal instruction. Celia had met Rosa at the general store, heard her speak, recognized something essential about her capability and her situation, and made her an offer on the spot with the decisive confidence of someone who has spent a lifetime recognizing wasted potential. Rosa, who had not expected to be seen so directly, said yes. The school was real. The school was Celia's, in the way things are yours when you made them from nothing. Harvey attended the first formal session, sitting in the back with James on his knee. He watched his wife stand at the front of the room and address 31 people of varying ages and backgrounds with the full force of her attention, organized and warm and absolutely in her element. Her voice going out to fill the room the way it always did, clear and unapologetic, and carrying easily to every corner. He thought about what she had told him, about the years of trying to be smaller, about the quilting circle and the committee letters and the man in Wichita. He thought about all the rooms she had been in where people had winced at the sound of her. This room did not wince. This room was leaning forward. He looked down at James, who was watching his mother with the expression of someone who already understood that she was the most interesting person in any place she entered. "That's your mother," Harvey said quietly. James made a sound of complete agreement. Christmas, 1880, at the house on Plum Creek was the kind of Christmas that becomes a story told for years. Dorothea came out on the Thursday before and stayed through the holiday. Ada and James Marsh came with their 3 children, who were 7, 5, and 2, and who found the farm endlessly fascinating and James Bristol endlessly entertaining. Tom Aldridge and his wife Caroline came for Christmas dinner, which was the first time they had been to the Plum Creek house, and Caroline Aldridge, who was a quiet, discerning woman of about 50, walked through the rooms and then sat down in the front room with its view of the rise and the creek and said, "You've made this beautiful," and meant it in the way that includes everything. The house, the life, the whole arrangement of it. Red duly came, because Red always came where there was good food and good company, and he arrived with a wooden horse he had carved for James, which was rough but recognizable, and he set it on the table, and James grabbed it immediately and put part of it in his mouth, which Red said was a perfectly reasonable response. Solomon Bell came, brought by Celia's invitation, and he sat at the table and said grace in a voice that made the room quiet in the best way, and the grace was long and particular and grateful, the way you pray when you have been through things and come to a table where you were genuinely welcome. Harvey looked down the table at all of it, at his wife laughing at something Ada had said, at his son in Dorothea's arms gumming the wooden horse, at Tom Aldridge talking quietly with James Marsh about the spring, at Red gesturing wildly about something to Rosa Garza, who had also been invited because Celia had said simply that Rosa had no family nearby and Christmas was not a time for that, at the remains of the finest meal he'd been near in his life. At the house his hands had helped build full of warmth and firelight and good noise. He thought, this is what it was all for. This is what $30 and a road west and years of patience were working toward. Not the land or the cattle or the deed in the strongbox, though those mattered. This. Celia caught him looking and gave him the small, warm smile that was just for him. He reached across and took her hand where it lay on the table and held it, and she turned her hand over and held his back, and they stayed like that for a while with the whole room going on around them, noisy and good and alive. Spring, 1881, brought an expansion that surprised Harvey by how natural it felt. He had always thought of the Plum Creek operation as cattle and the small garden, but Celia had been reading agricultural bulletins from the Kansas State Agricultural College in Manhattan. She had written to them, and they had sent her a stack of materials that she had worked through with the thoroughness she brought to everything, and she presented him in February with a detailed proposal for planting 20 acres of winter wheat in the fall. He read it carefully. He asked 4 questions, all good ones. She answered them. He thought about it for 3 days and then said yes. The proposal included financial projections, soil analysis based on what she had observed over 2 growing seasons, and a reference to a study from the Agricultural College about optimal planting dates for their latitude. Harvey showed it to Tom Aldridge, partly for a second opinion, and partly because he was still in the habit of valuing Tom's judgment. Tom read it and said, "Your wife is smarter about farming than most farmers." "I know," Harvey said. "You should let her do whatever she wants with that land," Tom said. "You'll be richer for it." "I know that too," Harvey said. The winter wheat was planned for fall. In the spring and summer, the orchard produced its first small harvest, 12 apples and 8 pears. Not enough to be a crop, but enough to be a beginning. And Celia made a single jar of applesauce from the apples, and they ate it on a Sunday morning with biscuits, and it tasted, to Harvey, like the best argument for patience he had ever encountered. James was walking. This was an event in the life of the Plum Creek house that Harvey had not been entirely prepared for. Not the mechanics of it, but the particular terror and joy of watching something you love become more itself. James was energetic and curious and startlingly loud, which surprised no one, and he had developed a relationship with the cattle that was deeply inadvisable given that he was barely a year old, and which required Harvey to install a second fence purely to prevent James from attempting to go in among them. "He wants to see them," Celia said, watching her son press his face between the fence rails. "He will not see them from inside the corral until he's at least 5, Harvey said firmly. 4, Celia negotiated. 4.5, Harvey said. "Done," Celia said, and they shook on it, which was how they resolved most things and which had never once felt like a compromise and always felt like an agreement. In August of 1881, Celia discovered she was expecting again. She told Harvey in the kitchen again, on a morning before the heat had fully come in, and he crossed to her, and this time, with James on his hip, kissed her with the easy, practiced warmth of a man who had been doing this for nearly 3 years and had found it continuously good. "January again?" he asked. "March, Dr. Harding thinks," she said. "A spring baby," he said. "Is that all right?" She was asking it lightly, but watching him with the particular attention she used when something mattered. "It's more than all right," he said. The winter wheat went in on schedule in October, and the fall was golden and cool, and Celia taught her school, and Harvey worked the herd, and James made friends with the horses in the barn, particularly a calm old mare named Bess who allowed herself to be petted, and climbed on in the moderate way of a creature that has made a considered decision about what she will and will not permit. The baby was born in late March, 1882, a clear week with the creek running full again and the first green coming into the grass. A girl this time, born in the early evening with the spring light coming through the west window of the bedroom in long gold bars. She was lighter than James had been, 8 pounds even, and she arrived more gradually, as though she was taking her time and would not be hurried, which Celia said was a sign of excellent character. They named her Ruth Eleanor Bristol. Ruth because Celia had loved the book of Ruth since her mother read it to her when she was 8, and had told her that Ruth was the example of a woman who chose her own loyalty and kept it completely. And Eleanor because Harvey's mother's name had been Eleanor, and she had died when Harvey was 15, and he had not spoken of her often but deeply. Ruth Eleanor Bristol had Celia's copper hair and Harvey's patient eyes, and a disposition that was, in the assessment of everyone who met her in her first weeks, already distinctly her own. She watched. She was quiet in the way that is not absence but attention, and she would fix her gaze on something, a beam of light, her father's face. Her brother's extravagant attempts to entertain her with such focused interest that it seemed less like a baby looking and more like a person deciding. James, who was 2 1/4 and of strong opinions, examined her carefully, and then announced, "Baby," with the air of someone making an official designation, and thereafter was protective of her in the concerned, sometimes excessive way of an older sibling who has decided something is his responsibility. The spring of 1882 was busy and good. The winter wheat harvest in July was not extraordinary. It was a first year and the soil was still adjusting, but it was solid, enough to cover the costs and show Harvey and Celia that the plan was worth continuing. Celia wrote to the agricultural college with her observations and received a letter back from a professor named Dr. Samuel Webb, who said her analysis of the soil response was precisely accurate and inquired whether she had any formal agricultural education. She wrote back that she did not. He wrote back again asking if she would be willing to correspond, as her field observations were more detailed and useful than most of his students managed to produce. She wrote back yes, obviously. Harvey read the letter from Dr. Webb and then looked at his wife, who was nursing Ruth and reading another agricultural bulletin with the one free hand, and thought for perhaps the 100th time that he had married someone who contained an amount of ability that the world was constantly failing to account for, and that it was his very good fortune to be the one who got to live next to all of it. "You should write to him about the northeast pasture," he said. "The grass variation there near the creek bank is interesting." She looked up. "I noticed that too. You think it's the water table? Probably. Worth asking someone who knows." "I'll write this week," she said. "Good," he said. She looked at him with the small, warm smile. He had stopped making himself look away from that smile a long time ago. In the fall of 1882, they planted the orchard's second expansion. 20 trees this time, apple and pear, and the plum trees near the creek that the water table had, by Celia's calculation, proven adequate for. Harvey dug the holes. Celia measured the spacing, with Ruth in a crib under the cottonwood tree and James handing Harvey the stakes with tremendous seriousness. The trees went in on a golden October afternoon with the light going long and the smell of turned earth in the air, and when they were done and the stakes were in, and the young trees stood in their careful rows, Harvey stood back and looked at what they had planted and felt the particular satisfaction of someone making something that will outlast them. "They'll be producing well by 1887, Celia said beside him. 1885 for some of them, he said. 1886 for the plums, she said. "You've calculated it," he said. "Of course I've calculated it," she said. James tried to eat dirt. Celia redirected him with the efficiency of long practice. Ruth watched the trees with her characteristic focused attention. By 1883, the Plum Creek Farm was the kind of operation that people in Caldwell referred to when they wanted an example of what could be done with good land and better management. The herd was 36 head. The wheat fields covered 40 acres, expanded from the original 20. The orchard was coming along. The house had been added to, a proper second bedroom for the children, a covered porch on the east side that caught the morning light from the rise, and a small study for Celia where she kept her correspondence and her agricultural bulletins and the notebooks she had been filling for 2 years with observations about the land. The reading school was now a real institution. It had moved from the church back room to a dedicated building on Maple Street, a small but adequate frame building that the town council had agreed to fund after a presentation by Celia that Harvey was told lasted an hour and covered literacy rates, economic outcomes, and the moral argument with such methodical thoroughness that the council had voted yes mostly because it was simpler than finding counterarguments. Rosa Garza was the school's full-time teacher now. Celia ran it and came in 3 mornings a week. Solomon Bell had become the unofficial custodian of the building and was, in his quiet way, one of its most important presences. James was 3 and starting the early work of letters. He came to the school on the morning Celia did and sat at one of the small desks with a concentration that was entirely Harvey's and a willingness to express loud opinions about his progress that was entirely Celia's. Ruth, at 1½ came along in the sling still, watching everything. On a Saturday in early June of 1883, Harvey and Celia rode out to the northeast corner of the property alone. It was something they did sometimes, left the children with Dorothea, who came out on Saturdays fairly regularly now, and went to the rise above the creek and stood there the way they had stood there on the first visit, looking at all of it. The orchard was visible from here, young but filling out. The cattle were in the south pasture and you could see them from the rise, small dark shapes on the green. The wheat fields were coming in gold, a week from harvest. The house sat solid and good on its foundation, with the porch that caught the morning, and the lavender that Celia had put in along the south side 2 years ago, and which was well established now. 5 years since she had arrived in Caldwell. Not quite 5 years since he'd been knocked off his horse by a battle cry and a falling trunk. 4.5 years since the social, since the fireflies, since he'd said loud is the only thing that travels across this land. 3.5 years of marriage and 2 children and 40 acres of wheat and a real herd and an orchard and a study full of notebooks and a school on Maple Street. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking about what I had in my pocket when I left Missouri," he said, "and what's in front of me right now." She looked at the land. "What were you thinking the first day you walked into Caldwell?" he asked. She considered it. "I was thinking that the sky here was bigger than anything I'd seen," she said, "and that I was going to take up as much of it as I could." He laughed. She laughed. The sound of her went out across the rise and down toward the creek and out to the wheat and the cattle and further, all the way to the edge of what you could see, which was very far in Kansas, and it did not diminish at all. "Celia," he said. "Harvey," she said. He took her hand. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Below them the land went on. The creek ran. The young orchard held its patient rows. The wheat moved in the wind the way the sea must move, in great slow waves that knew where they were going. He thought about loud things and lasting things, and how they were often the same. He thought about a woman who had been told her whole life that the best thing she could do was make herself smaller, and who had refused, and who was standing here now with her hand in his, and a school full of students and 40 acres of wheat, and her name on the correspondence of a professor in Manhattan, who said her observations were the best he received. He thought about how none of it would be here if she had listened to anyone who told her to be less. "The plums will fruit by 1886, he said. "I told you that," she said. "You did," he said. "I'm looking forward to it." She lifted her head and looked at him, and the afternoon light was doing the thing it always did with the color of her eyes. "Me too," she said. "I'm looking forward to all of it." The years that followed were the kind that don't make dramatic stories in the telling but are, in the living, everything. They were the years of Ruth learning to walk and then to run and proving to have her father's patience and her mother's precision. The years of James deciding at 5 that he was going to be a rancher, and at 6 that he was going to be a reader, and at 7 that he was going to be both, which Celia said was exactly right. The years of the orchard producing, first tentatively and then with the confidence of established trees, until the fall harvests were enough to sell in town, and Celia put up 60 jars of applesauce in a good year, and the plums came in purple and heavy by 1886 as she had predicted, and Harvey ate one standing at the tree and said it was the best thing he'd grown, and she said she had grown it, and he conceded that this was completely correct. The school grew. Enrollment in the late 1880s was over 50 students, with Rosa leading it fully now and Celia serving as what she called the administrator, and what everyone else called the person the school could not function without. The correspondence with Dr. Webb at the Agricultural College continued, and had become, by 1886, a serious enough exchange that he cited her field observations in a paper he presented to the Kansas State Agricultural Board, which she found satisfying in the way that things are satisfying when the world, even slowly, acknowledges what you've been saying. Harvey sold 30 head in 1887 at a price that was the best he'd gotten yet, and the farm was in its deepest health, the kind of health that comes not from a single good year, but from the accumulation of careful decisions over many good years and a few difficult ones. The difficult ones had been there too. 1885 had been a dry year, and the wheat was modest, and Harvey had sat with the ledger on a November evening working through what the numbers looked like, and Celia had sat across from him and worked through it with him, not to comfort him falsely but to think clearly beside him, and they had found the way through it the same way they found the way through everything, together and plainly. In 1888, a third child came, another boy. He arrived in August, blond in a way that surprised both of them. "My grandmother had light hair," Harvey said, which was the entire explanation, and energetic from his first breath, which was loud and definitive, and made Ruth, who was 6, look up from the corner where she was sitting and say simply, "Good lungs," with the assessment of someone who had a standard of comparison. They named him William Samuel Bristol. William because it was Harvey's father's name, and Samuel for doctor. Samuel Webb, whose suggestion had seemed right and which, when Celia wrote to inform him of it, produced a response of such moved and formal gratitude that she read it to Harvey twice. William was, by general agreement, a different proposition from his siblings. Where James was opinionated and verbal and Ruth was observant and precise, William was cheerful. Unrelentingly, generatively cheerful in the way of a person for whom the world is simply interesting and everything in it worth investigating. He smiled at the cattle. He smiled at strangers in town. He smiled at rain. He made the boarding house feel lighter on the Saturdays they visited Dorothea, and he made even the guarded Mrs. Paulson laugh. Mrs. Paulson had grown old in the years since Celia's arrival, in the gentle way of someone who has remained curious about the world. She was 73 now and a fixture in Caldwell in the way that certain excellent things become fixtures, irreplaceable and therefore present. She had been at the school opening and at every school event since. She had held James and Ruth, and now William, with the practiced ease of someone who understood babies to be among the world's most reliable arguments for optimism. She had said to Harvey once, standing in the boarding house kitchen while Celia was in the front room with some of the school's parents, "You know what you've got, don't you?" He had said yes. "Make sure she knows that you know," Mrs. Paulson said. He had gone into the front room and said nothing in particular, just stood near Celia, close enough that their arms were touching, and she had looked at him sideways with the small, warm smile, and she knew. Dorothea sold the boarding house in 1889 to a younger woman, and retired to a small house 2 streets over, which she ran with the precision and hospitality of someone who simply could not be otherwise. She came out to Plum Creek even more often now. She had a chair on the porch that everyone thought of as hers. Tom Aldridge died in the winter of 1890, quietly and without complaint, which was how he had done everything. The funeral was attended by most of Caldwell, because he had been there for most of them at one time or another. Harvey stood at the graveside with the particular grief of a man losing someone who had been a father in the ways that mattered. Caroline Aldridge took his hand and held it, and afterward Harvey went home to his wife and his children and his land, and sat on the porch in the cold until Celia came out with coffee and sat beside him, and they stayed there for a long time in the wind without needing to explain anything. Broken Spur was sold the following year, and the new owner was a decent enough man from Chicago who had capital and limited knowledge, and Harvey gave him 6 months of honest advice as a courtesy to Tom's memory, and then went back fully to his own place, which needed all of him anyway. Red Dooley, who had moved south to Oklahoma in 1886 with a wife named Clara who was nothing like Clara Whitmore and everything like warmth, wrote letters that arrived twice a year, full of news about his own small spread, and his 4 children and his horse that had survived a rattlesnake bite. And Celia wrote back for Harvey because Harvey's letter writing, though earnest, was slow, and she was faster and just as sincere. James was 13 in 1892, tall and dark-haired like his father, and already doing real work on the farm, the kind of work that was neither pretend nor excessive but genuinely useful. because Harvey had a belief that children should be given real responsibility at the pace they could handle it, and James had proven he could handle a great deal. He had also, at 13, read his way through every book Celia could find for him, which was a considerable number given her connections to the agricultural college, Dr. Webb, and the small but respectable library that had been established in Caldwell in 1891. Ruth was 11, and she had begun keeping her own notebooks in the precise, clear hand that was entirely Celia's influence, observations about the farm, about the weather, about the behavior of the apple trees in different seasons. Harvey read them and was moved by them in the way you are moved when a child reveals something you did not know they were working on. William was 4 and delighted with everything. In the fall of 1892, Celia received a letter from the Kansas State Agricultural College asking whether she would be willing to speak at a conference they were holding in January 1893 in Manhattan on the topic of practical field observations from homestead farming operations. The letter was addressed to Mrs. Celia Bristol and signed by Dr. Webb, and it asked her to present her observations on soil management and wheat cultivation in the Central Plains. She brought the letter to Harvey at supper. He read it. He set it down. He looked at her. "You're going," he said. "You'd have to manage the school while I'm gone," she said. "And the children." "You're going," he said. "It's January and it's a long way." "Celia," he said. She looked at him. The light in the kitchen was warm and the smell of supper was still in the air, and the children were various distances from sleep in various parts of the house. "Yes," she said. "I'm going." She went in January by train, with a leather case that contained her notebooks and a new dress that she had sewn herself and notes she had prepared with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. Harvey took her to the station in Caldwell on a cold morning with ice on the puddles and the sun just coming. She kissed James on the forehead, Ruth on the top of her red head, William enthusiastically on both cheeks, and then kissed Harvey, properly and completely. "I'll be back Thursday," she said. "Take your time," he said. "Say everything," she smiled. "I always do." She got on the train. He watched it go until it was a thin line of smoke against the Kansas sky. She came back on Thursday, as promised, full of the trip and what she had said, and who she had met and the response of the room when she had presented her observations, which she described as interested and respectful, though Harvey, reading between the lines of her account, suspected it had been considerably more than that. Dr. Webb had told her. She mentioned at some point while unpacking that her work deserved to be written up formally, published. "Are you going to?" Harvey asked. "I've been thinking about it," she said, which meant yes. She started writing in the evenings that winter after the children were in bed at the desk in her study with the lamp lit, the notebooks open around her, writing in the clear, exact prose of someone who knows what they want to say and says it. Harvey brought her coffee and did not interrupt. He sat in the front room sometimes and read, and the house was quiet around them both in the good way, occupied and warm. The paper was finished in March. It was sent to Dr. Webb. He had it reviewed by 2 colleagues. In June of 1893, it was published in the Proceedings of the Kansas State Agricultural Society under the name Celia Lockhart Bristol, which was what she had put on it, her full name, maiden and married both, because she had decided that she was not going to give up one or the other. They were both hers. Harvey framed it. He put it on the wall of the front room where it was the first thing you saw when you came through the door. She looked at it there and said nothing for a moment. "Harvey," she said. "You wrote it," he said. "I just put it where it could be seen." The years moved into the middle of the decade with the fullness of a well-built life. James went to a school in Wichita at 16 and came back at 18 with the particular knowledge that you could learn things outside of the land you grew up on and bring them home, and they would grow differently there. Ruth, who had never said much about what she wanted but who observed everything with complete attention, announced at 14 that she was going to study agriculture formally, and Celia looked at her daughter with an expression that Harvey thought might have been the purest pride he had ever seen on any face. "We'll find the way," Celia said. "I know," Ruth said. I knew you'd say that. William was in the primary school by now, reading with enthusiasm and the frank, cheerful certainty of someone who expected good things from books and was generally correct. Solomon Bell was in his 60s, still in Caldwell, still present at the school that Celia had started, which was now in its 15th year of operation. He had learned to write as well as read, and he had filled 3 notebooks with what he was writing, which he did not call anything except writing, and which Celia, who had read portions of it, thought was remarkable. She had said so to him plainly, and he had received it with the dignified quiet of a man who was not surprised that his work had merit, but was still moved to have it recognized. In the summer of 1895, Celia and Harvey stood on the rise above Plum Creek for the 4th time together in the way that meant something, looking at all of it. The orchard was in full production now. The cattle were a proper herd. The wheat fields were in their summer green, not yet harvest gold. The house was solid and added to and theirs in every fiber. James was 15, taller than Harvey, doing the work of a man. Ruth was 13 and keeping notebooks and planning a future that would require her to be heard clearly in rooms that hadn't expected her. William was 7 and delighted. The school was 15 years old and had graduated, in the broadest sense of the word, over 200 students. The paper on the wall of the front room had been cited in 3 subsequent publications. Red Dooley's letters still came twice a year. Dorothea was still in her house 2 streets over, still the best biscuit maker in all of Caldwell. Mrs. Paulson had died the previous winter at 78 with her full faculties, and her warm opinion of everything still intact. The school had held a remembrance for her, because she had been a student of Celia's in the later years, taking reading again after a long time away from it, and she had sat in those classes with the attentive pleasure of someone who had never stopped finding things interesting. Harvey looked at his wife on the rise above the creek in the summer light of 1895 and thought about all of it, the accumulation of it, the continuous becoming of it. "Still beautiful," she said, looking at the land. "Yes," he said, looking at her. She turned and caught him looking. He did not look away. She had crow's feet at the corners of her eyes now, from years of squinting in the prairie sun and gray threads in the copper hair, and she was more herself than ever, which he had not thought possible when she was 24 and already entirely herself. The years had not diminished her. They had added to her, the way good years add to good land, making it deeper, richer, more capable of producing exactly what it was always meant to produce. "We've done something here," she said. "We have," he said. "It's enough," she said, and she said it not in defeat but in the full satisfaction of someone who has measured what they have against what they needed and found the numbers, for once in their life, more than adequate. "More than enough," he said. She took his hand. He held it. Below them the creek ran in its bank. The cottonwoods stood in their long gold afternoon light. The orchard stood in its rows. The house stood on its foundation with the lavender along the south wall, and somewhere down in the south field, James was working and the cattle were grazing, and from the direction of the porch came the distant sound of William talking to himself about something, animated and carrying easily across the distance. Loud things carry, Harvey thought. He had said it once to a woman who was told all her life that her loudness was a problem, and she had looked at him in the firefly dark as if he had said something true, and he had meant every word. Loud things carry across this land. They always had. They always would. The voice of a woman who refused to be small, who had built a school and written papers and planted an orchard and raised 3 children with full honesty and loved one man with complete commitment. That voice had been carrying across this prairie for 17 years now, and it showed no sign of diminishing. And Harvey Bristol was the happiest man in Kansas, and he knew it and was grateful for it every single day. He would be grateful for it until his last, and this, above everything, was the thing he knew most certainly was true. Celia squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The afternoon went on around them, golden and wide and completely theirs.